Thank you, Mr. Bryant, for your kind introduction. It has been a real pleasure to get to know you over the past year or so, and I'm grateful to have spent the last few weeks with you on campus. Your dedication to the school has been so obvious in many positive ways, and I know you'll be missed by all. And we'll be praying for you as you embark on your new adventure. And Connor, that was great. You said everything I was planning on saying, so I'm just going to sit down right now. Seriously, I'd like to take this moment to thank the board of directors at Regents for inviting me to deliver this address. More often than not, I've been on the receiving end of a commencement address. Some would say I'm a glutton for punishment. In all seriousness, some addresses were quite excellent, but others not so excellent. But I've always wondered what I might say if I were given the opportunity to deliver a final charge to a group of graduates. When the board asked me to speak, I took some time to think through the chapters of my life since high school. I tried to identify my highs, my lows, my struggles, my successes, in hopes of landing on a topic that I thought would be relevant and meaningful. I did all this during a time of intensive reading through C.S. Lewis's major works. As I did this, a very peculiar thing happened. At the end of Lewis's book, Miracles, which is not highly read, he includes what is called an epilogue, in which he warns Christians what's at stake when they fail to detect the underlying philosophies that determine people's thought processes and experiences. In providing a solution to the problems as it relates to supernaturalism, Lewis says this: "You must develop a nose like a bloodhound for those steps in the argument which depend not on historical and linguistic knowledge, but on the concealed assumption that miracles are impossible, improbable, or improper," end quote. As I was reading this, I could not help but think to myself, if I had read this during high school or straight out of high school, I would have been spared a multitude of sins and many mindless wanderings. It then occurred to me that this is what I should share. So what you're about to hear is something I wish I heard when I was sitting in that seat. Graduates, I'm going to ask you to apply your minds for about 15 minutes or so as your last time as Regents students. This ceremony signifies an ending to an important chapter in your life. This is not the first chapter of your life, and it's definitely not your last. You should feel a deep sense of satisfaction and pleasure for having made it this far, and you should be grateful to all who made this possible for you: your parents, your teachers, your fellow classmates, Mr. Bryant, the board, and most importantly, your Creator, Jesus Christ. You worked hard to get here. Some of you worked so hard you cannot imagine working harder. And because of the challenge, you may be tempted to think that life must get easier from here on out. Perhaps you're thinking, surely life cannot demand more rigor, diligence, intellectual stamina, and spiritual struggle. Hasn't my training adequately prepared me for everything that life throws my way? To which I respond, yes and no. I answer yes because the tools for life and learning with which Regents Academy has equipped you are sufficient for inoculation or immunity from worldly influence. However, I answer no, because these same tools do not derive their efficacy ex opere operato. If you remember your Latin or your church history, ex opere operato was the popular 16th century phrase in Catholic sacramentalism that means from the work performed. It refers to the Roman Catholic belief that the sacraments confer grace regardless of the merits of the minister or the recipient. Now, I'm not here to give you a lecture on medieval Catholicism, but simply to point out that the tools of learning do not work this way. The time and energy you have invested to develop the tools of learning are no guarantee that they will benefit you for a lifetime. Rediscovered or not, Sayre's lost tools of learning are not a vaccine. They do not work irrespective of human will or divine grace. While you should feel proud of the diploma you will receive today, it is neither a shield nor a weapon. It will not stop bullets, bills, temptations to sensuality or selfishness, marital conflict, relational fallouts, death, and physical, psychological, and emotional suffering. All these things and more will come, And it will be your response to them, your resolve, your vigilance, your integrity, your faith in God, and your identity in Christ that will define you. In his famous book, Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton wrote, "If you leave a thing alone, you leave it to a torrent of change. If you leave a white post alone, it will soon be a black post." Chesterton's basic point is clear. Nature demonstrates that everything in nature is susceptible to decay or corrosion, including our habits. Just as a knife needs sharpening, so does our reason. Just as a tree needs watering, so does our spirit. And just as a garden needs cultivating, so do our affections. Without proper maintenance or sustenance, we fall into intellectual and moral entropy. We become susceptible to ideas, philosophies, cultural trends, and fashions that either deny God or replace him. In other words, your education and training here at Regents are Chesterton's white post. You can either maintain it, you can strengthen it, or let it waste away. It is at this point that I find C.S. Lewis to be particularly helpful. Lewis's book, Miracles, is largely a critique of modern scholarship, highlighting the philosophical assumptions modern scholars often make when entertaining the possibility or probability of miracles. He begins with the observation that it is useless to appeal to experience alone as an arbiter in matters of the supernatural because, quote, "what we learn from experience depends on the kind of philosophy we bring to experience," end quote. For example, Lewis says that if we begin with naturalism, then we believe that, quote, "the ultimate fact, the thing you can't go behind, is a vast process in space and time which is going on of its own accord," end quote. It's a spontaneous, unintended, unsolicited process. With naturalism, there's no free will, no purpose, no self-existence, no God. Thus, we thereby exclude the very possibility of things like miracles or God when we assume naturalism. And this assumption necessarily informs our experiences. Now, Lewis goes on for 200 more pages to critique naturalism as a philosophy and to propose supernaturalism as a superior alternative. And as great as these 200 pages are, and as much as you should read them on your own time, I'm going to assume that you assume supernaturalism for a moment, that you're assuming it to be true, and to get on with the upshot of all of this, which is this. You, graduates, are entering the world as sheep among wolves. Whether you go to college or a technical school, enter the workforce, watch the news, drive by the SFA campus, or spend 60 seconds on social media, you are going to observe, engage with, or be confronted by people whose worldviews are naturalistic, pantheistic, or pluralistic. You are going to witness or experience consumerism, narcissism, individualism, or permissiveness firsthand, perhaps inside of yourselves, and very often in disguise. Many of the people with whom you will interact are not going to play fair. They will beg the question, distract you with red herrings, tackle straw men, or engage in ad hominem argumentation. They will appeal to authority, inferiority, or simply to whatever feels good. And you, whether you believe it or not, are susceptible to all of these things. All of us are susceptible. In light of all the pernicious isms out there that can beset us, Lewis gives some advice, which I'll modify slightly for this context. First, we must have a posture of humility as we engage the world for Christ. Listen to that again. We must have a posture of humility as we engage the world for Christ. This is due in part to the fact that although we may be redeemed, the effects of sin still impair us. If we are oblivious to our sin or we deny its consequences, then we are that much more at risk. Lewis describes our condition, our susceptibility to anti-supernaturalist thinking by using the image of a virus. He says, quote, "We all have naturalism in our bones, and even conversion does not at once work the infection out of our system," end quote. A humble disposition protects us because it keeps us sober, admits weaknesses, and accepts our need for godly counsel, honest vulnerability, and intrusive accountability. And conversely, humility works against pretension, the charade that we have it all together. Several years ago, when I was graduating from Scarborough College, a classical Christian school in Fort Worth, the graduates decided to create a plaque and present it to the faculty. There were 11 of us. We were the founding members of the college, and some felt that we should leave our footprint. One student was asked to draft the message on the plaque, and we were all asked to proofread it. When I read the language of the plaque, I personally felt that it reeked of so much pride and arrogance as to betray the very spirit and purpose of the education we had just received. The man who wrote it acted as if we were ready to take on the whole world, as if we had learned everything there is to learn, as if our training was complete. Upon graduation, that man drove into the world of ministry full speed ahead. About 5 years later, I met that man at a place where I never thought I'd see him, on the campus of the same school pursuing more education. Now, I'm not here to criticize that man's decision to go into the ministry or praise his decision to go back to school. That's not the point. The point is the irony of that man's change in disposition. He went from being overly confident about the knowledge he had accumulated in college to being humble enough to go back to school. He recognized that training, both intellectual and spiritual, never ends. And this leads me to Lewis's second point. When we become relaxed, carefree, or nonchalant about life and the training necessary for the cultivation of wisdom and virtue, the world's assumptions quickly infiltrate our minds. Our enemy takes advantage of any such lack of vigilance or diligence in our behaviors and habits. Lewis speaks of this condition in terms of warfare. He says, quote, "Your rational thinking has no foothold in your merely natural consciousness except what it wins and maintains by conquest. The moment rational thought ceases, imagination, mental habit, temperament, and the spirit of the age take charge of you again. New thoughts, until they have themselves become habitual, will affect your consciousness as a whole only while you are actually thinking of them. Reason has but to nod at his post, and instantly nature's patrols are infiltrating." Isn't that great? Think of that. Reason has but to nod at his point, and instantly nature's patrols are infiltrating. That's classic C.S. Lewis for you right there. Graduates, Lewis isn't being extreme here, for Scripture itself speaks in very similar terms, does it not? The Apostle Paul uses the imagery of captivity in Colossians 2:8 when he says, "See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." Elsewhere, Paul speaks of donning the whole armor of God as a way of defending oneself against spiritual enemies and advancing the kingdom of God, Ephesians 6. And let's not forget history. We're not God's people. The Israelites literally taken into captivity as a result of sustained unrepentance for idolatry, for falling prey to the beliefs of surrounding nations. I was reading Psalm 107 just this morning, in which the psalmist vividly reminisces, "Those who dwelled in darkness and gloom were prisoners of captivity and iron." Psalm 107, verse 8. The fact is, we are engaging in warfare, or more accurately, we are engaged in multiple wars. Have you watched the news lately? We must continually be on guard, educating and re-educating ourselves and working assiduously and consistently to eradicate from our minds the kind of carnal, non-spiritual, fleshly thinking that is characteristic of the old man, not the new. Our minds are like raindrops. Upon hitting the soil, they tend to work around obstacles, not through them. And they follow the path of least resistance. So don't be like that. Upon graduation, work through the obstacles you face. Whatever resistance you may feel to follow Christ is to be expected. So don't be surprised. Be prepared. And to do that, you must maintain and develop great habits of the mind. The third piece of advice Lewis offers is this. You should expect that at some point in your life, God or supernatural things will become so familiar to you that they will feel like elements of a fantasy, the kind you may entertain only in a dream. You may desire them strongly to be true, but something inside of you, a feeling perhaps, will make you think that they are not part of the ordinary, real world. When this moment arrives, and it will for many of you, you must remember that feelings in and of themselves are unreliable. Feelings, like everything else in nature, tend to follow the grooves and ruts which already exist in the mind. If you start with nature, you become a naturalist. If you start with God, you become a supernaturalist. If you start with God but believe everything is one, you become a pantheist, and on the list goes. The frequent disproportionality of beliefs and feelings is obvious to most reasonable people. Think about it. How can a man who disbelieves in ghosts be scared out of his wits at a haunted house? And how reasonable is it for a moral relativist to destroy buildings in the name of injustice? Graduates, very often what you feel in the college classroom among unbelieving friends or even believing friends, or reading articles online has little correspondence to reason and is no evidence that something is or is not true. This is not to suggest that proper feelings cannot follow from true beliefs or what some have called belief feelings. Rather, I'm merely asserting that feelings that follow from reason do not occur except by long training. If you want feelings to accompany your true beliefs, then you must train your mind, cultivate your affections, and form your loves in a spirit of humility and acceptance of God's grace. Now, by talking about the perils of the many philosophies that will confront you in life, you may be thinking that I'm advocating a form of segregationism, isolationism, or sheltering, when in fact I'm suggesting just the opposite. As Lewis argues, the only way your mind and heart will be nourished and satisfied ultimately is to give full attention to the arguments that you hear that counter your faith. This is because naivety leads to seduction, but the truth sets you free. If you chew on the meat of the world's ideas but fail to spit out the bones, you will choke to death. Lewis has this to say about a lackadaisical approach to worldly engagement. Quote, "This is what I fear more than any positive argument against miracles, that soft, tidal return of your habitual outlook as you close the book, and the familiar four walls about you and the familiar noises from the street reassert themselves," end quote. What Lewis is getting at here are those mundane, familiar, and comfortable parts of our lives that keep our minds at ease and active or unchallenged. He compares the situation to the ocean's tide. If you build a sandcastle by the edge of the sea and you don't maintain it, by morning it will be completely gone. Similarly, if you throw dust into the air, gravity will eventually push it all down. If you stop going to the gym, as COVID-19 influenced many of us to do, you will get weaker, slower, heavier, and unhealthier. If you stop pulling weeds in your garden, it will choke out your produce. We could go on and on. The world is full of these images and analogies, which is precisely what Lewis wants to get across to his readers. In their natural states, our minds become passive. Before we know it, we begin to accept or allow what happens around us, what others do, or what others believe. We choose not to respond, resist, or engage. And that passivity results in a fate like Chesterton's Black Post, or like a sandcastle by the sea, decimated by the elements of the world. 12 years ago, PBS ran a story that appeared in their journal called Nature, which featured a detective named Holly on the Massachusetts State Force. Now, Holly was an expert at tracking down missing persons or hunting down criminals, and one could say she had extraordinary skills. The author of that journey described how Holly's capabilities were so unique, yet so accurate, that the results of her work were admissible evidence in the court of law. You see, Holly had an ultra-sensitive set of scent membranes that allowed her to distinguish smells at least 1,000 times better than most humans. In fact, researchers studied her nose and confirmed that it consisted of nearly 230 million olfactory cells. That's about 40 times the number in most humans. When Holly smelled a piece of clothing or something touched by a person, that air swept through her nasal cavity, and the vapors from the chemicals on that clothing settled into the mucus of her scent receptors. Those signals were then transmitted to what's called the olfactory bulb, where her brain analyzed the odors and created an odor image. Other studies have shown that the odor images Holly construed in a split second were more detailed than photographs appear to most humans. It's fascinating. Holly then used those images as a reference in locating the trail of many subjects. Once Holly identified a trail, she would not divert her attention despite being confronted by many other odors. She would not relent until she found the source of the scent or reached the end of the trail. Holly's drive to follow a scent was so intense that she could stick to a trail for more than 130 miles. That's a fact. Now, if you haven't figured it out already, Holly was in fact a bloodhound. Holly wasn't superhuman, she wasn't parahuman, she was non-human. Yet I think there's a lot we as humans can learn from Holly. As trainers of bloodhounds know well, the working ability of a bloodhound is about 75% nature and 25% nurture. While Holly was created with the raw equipment to detect scents from long distances and with a body designed to endure a hunt for long periods of time, she still could not reach her full potential or be useful to humans without the nurture of her trainer, her master. In the same way, God has created you, graduates, with the mind and a soul that, apart from his spiritual work in you and the constant training of good teachers, will become unfruitful and distracted. As gentle and noble as bloodhounds are known to be, they are equally characterized as independent, dogs with their own minds that make their own decisions rather than obey their owner's commands. And you see this happen most often when a bloodhound has picked up an interesting scent. Without training, that dog will become single-minded and determined to follow the trail as far as it possibly can, regardless of the will of its master. Similarly, you are entering a stage of life, one of greater independence, in a world full of intriguing smells. Some, if followed, will lead you to a rich and glorious banquet of divine truth and beauty, engendering greater trust in your master who trained you. But many, if followed independently, will lead to harm and regret. But there is no escaping the scents of this world. They will press upon you like the cows of Hereford, Texas, or the waste of Naples, Italy. There is no neutrality in this world. Smelling is not optional. And there is no idleness without defeat. Further training of the mind and the heart and the soul are absolutely essential if you are to maintain and grow in your faith. Thus, don't forget what brought you to this moment, training. Remember the power of thinking in community amidst fellow believers and under the direction and counsel of a godly teacher who encouraged you and corrected you. Remember the enchantment of discovery and imagination and reading, art, music, and history. Remember the discipline required to keep you progressing, to keep you from error, to keep you doing the next right thing. And as you go, remember what you feel right now, in this moment. That sense of satisfaction and pleasure and reward, which you know, which we all know, does not come for free. Now, the piece of stock paper that Dr. Sal is about to hand you is nothing more than a piece of paper. It's basically free. It costs maybe 15 cents. But we value it much more than it's literally worth because of what it signifies: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, faith, hope, and love. A diploma represents the fruit of your labor, and for that reason, we will give you one. But be warned, in a sense, the real labor of your life begins right now. So, go into the world like bloodhounds with determination, resolve, and a keen sense of what's right and what's wrong, what's a good argument and what's a bad argument, and what pleases your master and what dishonors him. Build and maintain your castles, and keep your posts clean and strong. Thank you very much.